The air in the conference room is thick and cold, smelling faintly of old paper and fear. It clings to the expensive suits, to the polished table, to the pit in my stomach. Across from me, his face is a mask of practiced calm, but his eyes, those familiar eyes I once drowned in, flicker with something sharp and cruel. My lawyer, bless her steady pulse, slides a document across the table. It isn't the divorce settlement, not yet. It's something else, something quiet and heavy. He glances at it, a dismissive tilt of his head. Then his gaze snaps back, focusing on me. The mask cracks. Confusion warps into disbelief, then into a raw, exposed panic I never thought I'd see on him. His mouth opens, but no sound comes out. The silence stretches, vibrating with everything left unsaid, all the calculated betrayals, all the unseen weapons. This isn't just a divorce negotiation anymore. This is the moment the ground gives way beneath his feet. And I am finally breathing free, watching him fall. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Before the conference rooms and the cold silence, there was just us, Michael, and me. Our life was built on the easy rhythm of shared laughter, late-night talks that spilled secrets under a blanket of stars, the comforting weight of his arm around me in the quiet dark. We met in college, two kids full of impossible dreams and undeniable chemistry. He wanted to build an empire. I wanted a life filled with love, stability, and purpose. Our dreams intertwined. We weren't rich, not by a long shot, but we had enough. Enough for a small apartment that smelled of coffee and his ambition. Enough for cheap dates that felt like grand adventures. Enough for the deep, unspoken certainty that we were meant to build our future hand in hand. He started his company almost straight out of school. A tech startup, buzzing with the frantic energy of young men convinced they were changing the world. He was brilliant, charismatic, able to sell sand in the desert. I was his quiet support, the anchor that kept him grounded. While he chased investors and coded late into the night, I worked my own job, a steady, sensible role in corporate law that paid the bills and offered health insurance. I used my legal skills, my network, my quiet determination to help him behind the scenes. I reviewed contracts, smoothed over disputes, even connected him with early clients. It wasn't just his dream, it was our dream. His success was our success. His future was our future. We saved meticulously, planning for a down payment on a house, for the day his company would finally turn the corner and start paying him what he was worth. I believed in him with a faith that was absolute, unshakable. I poured my energy, my time, my love, my small savings into our shared pot, into his potential. This wasn't a transaction. It was the fabric of our life together. Love, trust, mutual support. The foundation felt solid, built to last. Then came the envelope. It wasn't fancy, just standard legal paper, crisp and stark against the morning light spilling onto the kitchen counter. My name on it and a law firm's. Inside, a demand. Not a polite request, but a demand for immediate payment. $850,000. An impossible number that swam before my eyes, blurry with shock. It was a corporate debt, a lawsuit settlement he'd lost, something he'd been hiding, hoping to fix before I ever found out. But he hadn't fixed it. And now, it was here, a cold, hard reality crashing into our quiet life. He was pale, his usual confidence evaporated, replaced by a hunted look. He mumbled apologies, explanations that tangled in his throat. A bad deal, a ruthless competitor, a legal trap he couldn't avoid. He looked genuinely terrified, and that fear, more than the monstrous number, is what gutted me. He was desperate, cornered. The man I loved, the man I believed in, was drowning, and he was pulling our life down with him. He said the company would fold, that we would be ruined, that everything we'd worked for was gone unless this debt was paid, and paid now. His desperation was a physical force, pressing in on me. He needed me. He needed my help. He needed my steady hand when his was shaking. The number was terrifying, yes, but the thought of him losing everything, of our future dissolving, was worse. I looked at him, really looked at him, saw the fear in his eyes, and the decision, agonizing as it was, began to form. I couldn't let him sink. I couldn't let us sink. Paying off $850,000 when you aren't independently wealthy is not just writing a check. It's dismembering your life piece by piece. It meant selling the dreams we'd saved for. The down payment disappeared in a puff of smoke. My sensible savings, built over years of careful budgeting, vanished. My small inheritance from my grandmother, meant for our future children's education, gone. But it wasn't enough. Not even close. We had to sell assets. My car went first, then his. We moved from our comfortable apartment to a smaller, shabbier one, shedding furniture, shedding space, shedding the physical anchors of our stability. I picked up extra legal consulting work on the side, long nights poring over contracts after my day job, eyes burning, fueled by caffeine and a desperate hope that this would be enough. He tried to help, he said. He worked even longer hours, chasing new deals, but the pressure seemed to paralyze him more than energize. He was short-tempered, easily frustrated. The easy rhythm of our life fractured. Conversations revolved around money, or the lack of it, or the looming deadline. The laughter was gone, replaced by strained silence and nervous calculations. I felt the weight of the debt like a physical burden, heavy on my shoulders, stealing my sleep. My own career stalled. I couldn't take on challenging projects or networking opportunities because every ounce of my energy was focused on earning money, any money, to throw into the abyss of his debt. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was the emotional toll. Supporting him through his panic, absorbing his stress, trying to keep his spirits up when mine were flagging. It felt like I was doing all the paddling while he sat in the boat, frozen by fear. But I loved him. I believed in the man he was supposed to be, the man he had been before this disaster. I believed that once we were through this, once the debt was gone, we would recover. We would rebuild. We would be stronger for having faced this fire together. The debt felt like a living entity, always hungry, always demanding more. We cut every corner. Grocery bills were microscopic. Entertainment was non-existent. Every spare cent, every unexpected bonus, every tax refund went straight to the lawyers, to the creditors. It was a slow, grinding process that seemed endless. The initial relief of finding enough money for a payment was quickly overshadowed by the realization of how much was still left. It was a treadmill where the speed kept increasing. His company, though still operating, wasn't generating the kind of revenue needed to service the debt quickly. He talked about big contracts on the horizon, potential investments, but they felt like mirages in a desert of financial strain. The stress etched lines on his face, lines that didn't soften when he looked at me. The gratitude I expected, the relief, the shared sense of overcoming a monumental challenge, never fully materialized. Instead, a new kind of distance grew between us. He retreated into his work, his worries, leaving me alone with the spreadsheets and the dwindling bank accounts. I was fighting the dragon, and he was watching from the sidelines, occasionally sighing about how hard his life was. The shared dream started to feel like my solo burden. The foundation that had felt so solid began to show hairline cracks, invisible at first, then widening with every passing, stressful month. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the mountain began to shrink. The payments, my extra work, the sacrifices, they were working. The impossible number dwindled. And as the financial pressure eased, something shifted in Michael. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a subtle, insidious change. The hunted look faded, yes, but it wasn't replaced by relief or renewed warmth. It was replaced by indifference, or worse, impatience. He started staying out later, business dinners that stretched into the night, networking events that felt less like work and more like an escape. When he was home, he was on his phone or distant, lost in his own world. He stopped asking about my day, stopped noticing my exhaustion, stopped offering the small gestures of affection that had been the lifeblood of our marriage. The conversations about money stopped, but they weren't replaced by conversations about us, about rebuilding, about the future we'd saved. They were replaced by silence. A cold, empty silence that filled our small apartment. He started talking about space, about finding himself after the stress of the debt. He spoke about his company's renewed potential, now free of the crushing burden, and his voice held a different kind of excitement, one that didn't include me. The shared dream was no longer shared. It was his again, and I was just a forgotten chapter, the footnote about the debt that had been inconveniently large. It felt like the moment the debt was paid off, my purpose in his life evaporated. I was no longer the solution to his problem, I was just there. An obstacle to the new life he was starting to envision, a life that was suddenly, painfully clear, didn't include the woman who had sacrificed everything to save him. This wasn't stress anymore. This felt deliberate. This felt calculated. The hairline cracks weren't just cracks, they were fault lines, running deep and threatening to split us apart. The man I saved was pulling away, leaving me adrift in the quiet aftermath of the storm I had weathered. The envelope this time was different. Thicker paper, a fancy law firm logo. Inside, not a demand for money, but a demand for my life back. Or rather, for his life back, without me in it. Divorce papers. The world tilted. The breath left my lungs in a rush. I remember the cold floor beneath my bare feet, the sound of the paper rustling in my shaking hands, the way the sunlight suddenly felt too bright, too cruel. He wasn't there when I found them. He was already gone, leaving the legal documents to do his dirty work. His petition was polite, sterile, devastating. It spoke of irreconcilable differences, of growing apart. It made no mention of the debt, of my sacrifices, of the $850,000 I had poured into saving his company, saving him. It simply stated the facts. We were married on this date. We have no children. We have community property to divide. His proposal for that division was insulting. He offered me a pittance, a fraction of the assets, certainly nothing close to the amount I had paid for his debt. He argued the company had little value at the time of the divorce filing due to lingering financial difficulties, the very difficulties I had just erased. He expected me to accept it, to walk away quietly, having served my purpose. The pain was a physical agony, sharp and suffocating. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the brutal invalidation of my past, of my love, of my sacrifices. It felt like a cruel joke. I had fought tooth and nail to save him, and his thanks was to discard me the moment he was back on his feet, stronger and freer because of my actions. The betrayal was absolute, a poison that seeped into every memory, every shared smile, every whispered promise. It wasn't just divorce, it was erasure. He was erasing me from the narrative of his success, pretending my contribution was negligible or worse, non-existent. I felt lost, adrift. The life I had built, the future I had saved, was being stolen from me by the very man I had saved it for. Friends offered platitudes, family worried. But no one could truly grasp the depth of the wound. It wasn't just the money, though the financial precariousness was terrifying. It was the fundamental violation of trust, the chilling realization that the person I had loved and supported unconditionally was capable of such cold, calculating cruelty. I felt stupid, naive, used. Every sacrifice, every late night, every tear shed over bills felt like a mockery. I had traded my security, my peace of mind, for a man who saw me as disposable once the job was done. I was in a freefall, the ground rushing up to meet me, and there was no one to catch me. All seemed lost. One evening, sitting alone in the small, silent apartment, surrounded by boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack, staring at the divorce papers that felt like a death sentence, something shifted. The despair was still a heavy cloak, but beneath it, a spark flickered. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was colder, harder. It was anger, a deep, simmering rage that coiled in my gut. He thought he could just use me and throw me away? He thought he could take my sacrifice and build his renewed empire on it, leaving me in the dust? The sheer arrogance of it, the casual cruelty, was breathtaking. I thought back to the early days of his company, how I had helped, The endless hours reviewing documents, the calls with potential partners, the agreements I had pored over, ensuring they were watertight. My legal background, my network, had been invaluable. I remembered specific projects, specific deals. There was one in particular, a key licensing agreement. It wasn't something he had been keen on initially. He thought it was too complicated, the terms too restrictive. But I had seen the potential. I had pushed for it. I had used my contacts, my knowledge of contract law, to negotiate the terms, to make it work. I had even used a small portion of my own separate savings, money I had before we were even married, money he didn't know about, to cover specific legal fees and filing costs for that particular agreement years ago, just to get it finalized quickly. It was a small amount in the grand scheme of the later debt, easily forgotten, but it tied me directly to the creation and funding of that specific asset. The memory wasn't just a nostalgic pang, it was a key. That licensing agreement. It wasn't just a contract. It was the contract that allowed his company to use a crucial piece of technology, a proprietary process that was fundamental to their main product. Without it, his company would be significantly hampered, maybe even crippled. At the time, we treated it like any other piece of business. But now, in the cold light of his betrayal, I saw it differently. I hadn't just reviewed it, I had been instrumental in bringing it into existence. My fingerprints were all over it, not just emotionally but legally. A cold calm settled over me, replacing the panic and despair. He thought he was fighting for assets accumulated during the marriage, assets I supposedly had less claim to because I wasn't directly involved in the day-to-day operations of his business, his argument. But this was different. This was an asset I had a direct, documented hand in creating and funding before the main marital wealth accumulation, then later integrated into the company he now claimed was solely his. My initial investment, however small, coupled with my legal work and negotiation, gave me a unique, perhaps even ownership, stake in that specific agreement, independent of my status as his wife. The spark became a flame. Not a hopeful one, but a hard, steady burn. He wanted a fight? I would give him one. He wanted to erase me? I would become impossible to ignore. He wanted to build his future on my sacrifice? I would pull the very foundation out from under him. My determination crystallized. I wasn't just fighting for money anymore. I was fighting for my dignity, for recognition of my worth, and for a chillingly satisfying form of justice. I called my lawyer, the steady one, the one who understood more than just the law, who understood betrayal. Her voice was calm, professional. I explained about the licensing agreement, my involvement, the old paperwork, the small investment. She listened, asked sharp, precise questions. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then her voice, low and considering. That changes things. Significantly, the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was planning an attack. The legal process was a brutal education in the mechanics of cold, calculated conflict. Every interaction with Michael, through his lawyers, felt like a fresh wound. He maintained his facade of calm, reasonable detachment, while his legal team painted me as a grasping ex-wife trying to capitalize on his success. They minimized my contributions, dismissed my sacrifices as simply the duty of a supportive spouse. It was infuriating, soul-crushing. But the anger, the cold determination born from that moment of clarity, kept me going. My lawyer worked tirelessly, meticulously. We gathered every scrap of documentation related to the licensing agreement, old emails, draft contracts, my notes from negotiation meetings, bank statements showing the small transfer for legal fees from my separate account years ago. It was like piecing together a forgotten puzzle. Each document was a quiet validation of my story, a refutation of his narrative of my irrelevance. We built our case slowly, deliberately, keeping it hidden from his side. We didn't want to reveal our hand too early. We wanted the element of surprise. We wanted him to be overconfident, to believe he had already won. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted. Living costs without my full income, legal fees piling up. There were days I felt the despair creeping back in, the fear that even with the licensing agreement, he would find a way to twist it, to minimize its value, to keep me trapped in the financial and emotional fallout of his betrayal. His lawyers pushed for quick settlement, offering slightly more than their initial insult, but still nowhere near what I deserved. It was a tactic, hoping I was financially vulnerable and emotionally exhausted enough to give in. And I was exhausted. The stress was a constant companion, a knot in my stomach. But the memory of his cold eyes, the casual way he discarded me after I saved him, fueled my resolve. I would not break. I would not settle for less than justice. I held onto the secret of the licensing agreement like a hidden weapon, waiting for the right moment to strike. We were scheduled for a mandatory mediation session, a final attempt to settle before a potentially long and messy court battle. My lawyer agreed. This was the moment. The mediation room was suffocating. Neutral territory, they called it. It felt more like a sterile battleground. Michael sat across the table, his lawyer by his side, radiating a quiet confidence that bordered on smugness. He offered a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. My lawyer and I sat opposite them, a united front in a world trying to pull me apart. The mediator, a calm, gray-haired woman, began the proceedings, outlining the points of dispute, primarily the division of assets and the valuation of Michael's company. His lawyer spoke first, presenting their view, emphasizing Michael's hard work, the risks he took, the company's modest valuation, conveniently ignoring the recent disappearance of that massive debt. They reiterated their settlement offer, painting it as generous given my limited direct involvement in the business. Michael nodded along, occasionally interjecting with a carefully worded statement designed to portray himself as reasonable and me as difficult. I listened, my heart pounding, a cold sweat on my palms. It was hard to hear them twist the truth so effortlessly, to minimize everything I had done. But I held my tongue, my gaze fixed on my lawyer. This wasn't my moment to speak.
Not yet.
My lawyer began her response. She went through the usual points, challenging their valuation, outlining my contributions as a spouse, the lost career opportunities, the emotional support, the standard arguments for marital property division. Michael shifted in his seat, the faintest hint of boredom on his face. This was the script he expected. He was prepared for these arguments. Then, her voice shifted. It became sharper, more focused. However, she said, her eyes locking onto Michael's lawyer, there is a significant asset that has been misrepresented, or perhaps entirely overlooked, in their valuation. Michael's lawyer raised an eyebrow, a flicker of annoyance. And what asset would that be? My lawyer didn't answer immediately. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick binder. We are referring, she stated clearly, to the primary licensing agreement for the core technology utilized by Mr. Smith's company. Michael's face went rigid. The smugness vanished, replaced by a blank stare. His lawyer leaned forward, a sudden intensity in her posture. The licensing agreement is a company asset, she said, her voice sharp with suspicion. It's been accounted for. Has it? My lawyer asked, her tone deceptively mild. Because our research, based on documentation provided by my client, indicates her direct and instrumental role in securing this agreement. Not merely as a supportive spouse, but as a key negotiator and, crucially, as an initial financial contributor to the securing of the license rights themselves, years ago, prior to the significant marital debt issue. She slid copies of the relevant documents across the table. The initial proposal I'd drafted, emails detailing my negotiations with the technology provider, the signed agreement itself, and finally, the bank statement showing the transfer from my separate account for the initial legal and filing fees specifically for that license. Michael stared at the papers, his face draining of color.
He stammered, That
was just a small amount. For legal fees. It doesn't mean anything. On the contrary, Michael, my lawyer said, using his first name, a rare, cutting touch, it means everything. Coupled with her documented work on the negotiation and securing of the rights, it establishes a clear claim. Furthermore, the way the original agreement was structured, which my client was directly involved in negotiating, includes specific clauses regarding her status as a key individual instrumental in the licensing. Clauses that become highly relevant in the event of significant changes to the company's ownership structure, such as, say, a divorce proceeding where marital assets are being divided. She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Based on our expert valuation, she continued, her voice picking up speed, and considering the critical nature of this licensed technology to the company's current and future revenue streams, we contend that the rights to this license, or a significant percentage thereof, belong not just to the company, but are directly tied to my client's initial contribution and the specific structure she helped negotiate. Our valuation of her claim to these rights, based on market rates for similar licenses and the company's projected earnings, is substantial. She named a figure, a number that made the $850,000 debt I had paid seem almost trivial in comparison. A number tied directly to the future earnings of his company, earnings he intended to enjoy without me. Michael gasped a raw, choked sound. His lawyer looked utterly blindsided, flipping through the documents, her eyes wide. This is absurd, she sputtered, but her voice lacked conviction. The documents were clear. My involvement was documented. The small, forgotten investment from my separate funds provided a clear, undeniable hook. The specific clauses I had insisted on in the original negotiation, clauses designed to protect the license holder in unforeseen circumstances, now protected me. He had taken credit for the deal, forgotten the details of its creation, and completely overlooked the meticulous groundwork I had laid years ago. He tried to argue, to bluster, to claim I was exaggerating my role. But the proof was on the table. Emails with timestamps, signed documents, bank records. The licensing rights weren't just a line item on a balance sheet. They were the engine of his company, and I held the key to the engine room. His betrayal, his attempt to erase me, had led him to overlook the very asset he depended on, the asset I had helped secure in a way that protected my stake, even before I knew I'd need protecting from him. The look on his face, the dawning horror as he realized the full extent of what I held, what he had lost through his own hubris and cruelty, was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. He thought he was taking his company and leaving me with nothing. He didn't know I already owned the key to the kingdom. The mediation ended abruptly after that. There was no more talk of reasonable settlements or mutual understanding. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by desperation. The revelation of the licensing rights wasn't just a complication, it was a seismic shift. My lawyer's valuation, based on my documented claim to the core technology license, meant I wasn't just entitled to half of the current undervalued assets, I was potentially entitled to a significant portion of the company's future revenue, tied directly to those rights. He couldn't run his business without that license. And he couldn't have the license without dealing with me. His legal team, initially so aggressive and dismissive, became frantic. They tried to challenge the validity of my claim, to argue that my early investment was negligible, that my role was merely spousal support. But the documentation was irrefutable. The emails showing my lead in negotiations, the bank transfer from my separate account specifically for the license legal fees, the carefully worded clauses in the original agreement I had helped craft, they all pointed to a deeper, more personal connection to that specific asset than mere marital contribution. It wasn't just about community property acquired during the marriage. It was about an asset I had a direct, documented hand in securing, almost independently, years before the debt crisis even hit. The legal battle stretched on for months, but the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer the one holding all the cards, dictating terms from a position of strength built on my sacrifice. He was the one scrambling, trying to find a way out of the trap he had set for himself. Every legal maneuver he attempted was met with calm, documented facts about the licensing agreement and my stake in it. His attempts to devalue the company were countered by evidence of its reliance on the licensed technology, the very technology one controlled. The resolution, when it finally came, wasn't in a courtroom, but in a lengthy, tense negotiation session that felt less like a legal discussion and more like a surrender. Faced with the undeniable strength of my claim to the licensing rights and the potential cost of a trial where all the details of his betrayal and my sacrifices would become public record, he capitulated. The settlement was substantial, far more than the $850,000 I had paid off. It wasn't just half the marital assets. It was a significant payout directly tied to the value and importance of the licensing agreement, essentially buying out my stake in the rights I had helped secure. I also retained certain ongoing royalties from the licensed technology for a set period, a constant reminder of the foundation I had laid for his success. He kept his company, yes, but he paid a heavy price for trying to erase me from its history and from his life. He learned, in the most financially painful way possible, that some contributions cannot be dismissed, some foundations cannot be erased, and some women, once discarded, rise with the very weapon they were meant to abandon. Walking out of the lawyer's office that final day, holding the signed settlement papers, felt strange. There was no triumphant music, no confetti. Just the quiet hum of the city, the setting sun casting long shadows. I was financially secure again, perhaps more so than ever before. The debt was gone, my own security was restored, and I had been undeniably, powerfully vindicated. I had won. I had turned his betrayal back on him, using the very asset he had overlooked, the asset I had quietly secured years ago, to rebuild my life on solid ground while he felt the tremor of his own making. But beneath the relief, beneath the cold satisfaction, there was an ache. The victory was mine, hard-won and absolute, but it came at the cost of a shattered marriage, a broken trust, a lost dream of a shared future. The man I had loved, had saved, had revealed a capacity for cruelty that I would carry the scar of forever. The money was cold comfort for the warmth that had been extinguished. The freedom from debt and his control was immense, but it was a freedom born from profound loss. I looked up at the sky, a pale, washed-out blue. The storm had passed. I had weathered it alone, using my own strength and the forgotten tools I had forged years before. I was standing, bruised but not broken. I had learned a terrible lesson about the true cost of unconditional love for someone who ultimately only loved himself. But I had also learned about my own resilience, my own quiet power, my ability to build something lasting even in the face of devastation. My life wasn't the one I had planned, not the shared dream I had nurtured. It was different. It was entirely mine. And for the first time in a long time, facing the uncertain path ahead, I felt a flicker of something new. Not just relief, not just vindication. Something that felt cautiously, tentatively like hope. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.